The most dangerous mistake a person in authority can make is believing that respect belongs to a uniform instead of the truth. The hearing room inside the state law enforcement headquarters had become so quiet that even the faint hum of the ceiling lights seemed louder than anyone's breathing. Every chair was occupied by investigators, attorneys, command staff, and court officials who understood that the next few minutes would decide far more than the future of a single police officer. At one side of the room sat Officer Daniel Brooks, his dark blue uniform still perfectly pressed, his badge catching the morning light as though it carried the same confidence it always had. Across from him sat Federal Judge Marcus Bennett, wearing a tailored navy suit instead of the black judicial robe that had defined so much of his professional life. His hands rested calmly on the table before him, his expression measured and composed, revealing neither anger nor satisfaction. The distance separating the two men was only a few feet, yet it felt like the space between two completely different ideas of justice. Several days earlier, they had met on an ordinary city street under flashing emergency lights. Today, they met again beneath the quiet authority of due process. Nobody in the room seemed interested in opinions anymore. Those had already filled television broadcasts, social media discussions, and newspaper headlines for nearly a week. Speculation had traveled faster than facts, and assumptions had spread farther than evidence. Now only authenticated recordings, verified reports, and synchronized digital timelines mattered. At the center of the hearing room stood a large presentation screen connected to multiple secure evidence systems. Every file had been reviewed, preserved, and certified according to procedure before arriving here. A legal technician quietly confirmed that the evidence chain remained intact from the moment each recording had been collected until this very hearing. The administrative panel listened carefully before acknowledging the certification without unnecessary discussion. Marcus looked briefly toward the display, then lowered his eyes to a folder. Resting beside him, he had spent an entire career reminding others that the law demanded patience before judgment. Ironically, he now found himself relying upon that same principle more than ever. Daniel remained convinced that his actions had been justified. He had repeated the same explanation through every interview conducted since the incident. He believed he had made a reasonable decision during a routine traffic stop. He believed public criticism had grown from incomplete videos shared online. Most importantly, he believed the evidence would eventually support his written report. Confidence still surrounded him, although it no longer carried the certainty it once had. Near the front of the room, the lead investigator organized several folders before stepping toward the display. She explained that the hearing would not begin with testimony because memories could differ, emotions could influence perception, and assumptions often filled the spaces between facts. Instead, the panel would first examine objective evidence gathered from independent sources. Only after every recording had been reviewed would witnesses be invited to speak. Several members of the panel nodded in agreement. The process reflected exactly what every courtroom expected from justice itself. Outside the hearing room, reporters waited behind security barriers, hoping to catch even a brief glimpse of those involved. They had already constructed countless theories about what had happened during the traffic stop, but none of them could see the screen that remained dark inside the room. Behind that blank display rested a story that neither headlines nor opinions had managed to tell correctly. The chair of the administrative panel folded his hands together before looking around the room one final time. His voice remained calm, deliberate, and free from emotion as he addressed everyone present. The purpose of this hearing is not to protect reputations or satisfy public opinion. It is to determine the truth. Without another word, the technician reached for the control panel, and the first authenticated recording prepared to reveal how one ordinary afternoon had changed two lives forever. The first recording carried everyone in the hearing room back 4 days earlier, long before reporters gathered outside courthouse doors and before anyone had questioned the decisions made during a routine afternoon patrol. Federal Judge Marcus Bennett left the federal courthouse just after 5 o'clock, ending another day filled with hearings, written opinions, and careful interpretation of the law. As always, he removed his black judicial robe before leaving his chambers, folded it neatly with practiced care, and placed it across the back seat of his dark gray sedan. To anyone passing by, it was simply another garment resting inside an ordinary vehicle. Marcus never imagined that a piece of clothing representing years of public service would soon become the center of an encounter that would alter two lives. The courthouse staff wished him a pleasant evening as he walked through the marble lobby carrying a worn leather briefcase containing case files he planned to review later that night. He smiled politely, thanked the security officers by name, and stepped into the cool evening air. The streets of downtown were beginning to fill with commuters heading home. Office lights reflected against the windows of nearby buildings, while restaurants welcomed the early dinner crowd. Marcus followed the same route he had driven hundreds of times before, listening quietly to classical music as traffic moved steadily through the city. His schedule for the following morning included several important hearings, and his thoughts remained focused on legal questions rather than anything happening outside his windshield. Several miles away, Officer Daniel Brooks began the second half of his patrol shift. He had spent nearly 10 years wearing the uniform and believed experience had taught him how to recognize suspicious behavior before others noticed it. After completing a brief report from an earlier call, he acknowledged a routine dispatch update describing a general vehicle matching the broad description of one connected to an unrelated investigation taking place in another section of the city. The information contained no license plate number, no confirmed driver, and no instruction directing officers to stop any specific vehicle. Even so, Daniel continued scanning traffic with heightened attention, convinced that instincts often revealed what paperwork could not. As Marcus approached a busy intersection, the traffic signal turned green, and his sedan continued smoothly through the crossing at the posted speed limit. Daniel noticed the dark gray vehicle several lanes ahead and began following it from a distance. Nothing about the driver's behavior appeared unusual. The vehicle remained within its lane, signaled properly, and obeyed every traffic regulation. Still, Daniel continued watching. When the next traffic light turned red, both vehicles came to a complete stop. Daniel glanced toward the rear window of Marcus's sedan and noticed the carefully folded black robe resting across the back seat. From where he sat, it looked unfamiliar and out of place. Rather than considering an ordinary explanation, he immediately reached his own conclusion. By the time the light changed again, curiosity had quietly transformed into certainty inside his own mind. Marcus remained completely unaware that another driver had begun building assumptions about him without exchanging a single word. He continued toward home exactly as he had planned, believing the day had already ended. Behind him, Daniel activated the emergency lights on his patrol vehicle. Red and blue reflections spread across nearby storefront windows as evening traffic slowed to make room. Marcus looked into his rearview mirror, signaled, and calmly guided his sedan toward the shoulder, unaware that the folded robe resting silently behind him was about to become the object of ridicule instead of respect. Marcus Bennett lowered his driver's side window before the patrol vehicle had fully come to a stop behind him. The evening air remained calm, carrying only the distant sound of passing traffic and the steady rhythm of engines moving through the city. He placed both hands comfortably on the steering wheel, where they could be seen without question. Years spent inside courtrooms had taught him that calm often accomplished more than confrontation, and he saw no reason to treat this encounter any differently. Officer Daniel Brooks stepped out of his cruiser with measured confidence, adjusting the radio attached to his shoulder before approaching the sedan. His eyes briefly scanned the vehicle, then settled almost immediately on the folded black robe visible across the back seat. A faint smile crossed his face, not one of courtesy, but of quiet amusement. He stopped beside the open window and greeted Marcus in a voice that sounded more skeptical than professional. Marcus returned the greeting respectfully and waited for an explanation. Daniel requested a driver's license, vehicle registration, and proof of insurance. Marcus answered without hesitation, informing the officer that the documents were stored in the glove compartment before reaching for them slowly. Daniel accepted the paperwork, glanced at the license, then looked back at Marcus with an expression suggesting that something did not fit the story he had already created in his own mind. His attention shifted once more toward the robe. "Interesting costume," he remarked with a short laugh. "Going to a party after work?" Marcus followed his gaze and immediately understood what Daniel meant. He answered in the same calm tone that had never left his voice. "That is my judicial robe." Daniel looked at him for another moment before smiling again, this time more openly. "Sure it is." Marcus did not react to the sarcasm. Instead, he simply waited, believing the conversation would return to whatever legitimate reason had prompted the stop. Daniel walked back to his patrol vehicle, entered information from the driver's license into the computer, and watched the screen as records began appearing. Before allowing the system to finish loading every available detail, he looked once more toward Marcus's sedan. Confirmation bias had already taken hold. The robe, the driver's appearance, and the ordinary circumstances before him had merged into a story that existed only in his imagination. Returning to the sedan, Daniel informed Marcus that he needed him to step out of the vehicle. Marcus politely asked whether there was a specific legal reason for the request. The question was respectful, direct, and entirely consistent with the language of someone familiar with constitutional procedure. Rather than answering immediately, Daniel interpreted the question itself as resistance. His posture became firmer, and his voice grew noticeably less conversational. Marcus slowly opened the door, stepped on his shoulder, and stood beside his vehicle with complete cooperation. Passing motorists glanced toward the flashing emergency lights, but continued driving. A few pedestrians on the nearby sidewalk slowed briefly before moving on. Daniel gestured toward the back seat. "So, tell me about the robe." Marcus looked at it for only a second before answering. "I serve as a federal judge." Daniel shook his head almost immediately, dismissing the statement before considering whether it could be true. "That robe does not make you a judge," he replied. "Anybody can buy clothing." Marcus remained composed, making no attempt to argue. "You are entitled to verify my identity through official channels," he said evenly. "I only ask that we follow proper procedure." Daniel heard the words, but not their meaning. Certain that he had already figured everything out, he chose confidence over curiosity, unaware that every second of the encounter was being preserved by multiple cameras that would later distinguish assumptions from facts with remarkable precision. Daniel Brooks studied Marcus Bennett for another long moment, as though confidence alone could determine whether someone was telling the truth. The explanation he had just heard did not fit the picture he had already built in his mind, and instead of questioning his assumptions, he trusted them even more. Marcus remained standing beside his sedan, composed and attentive, offering no sign of frustration despite the growing tension. He had spent decades reminding attorneys, witnesses, and juries that facts deserve patience. Now, he quietly practiced the same principle himself. Daniel informed Marcus that he was being temporarily detained while additional verification could be completed. Marcus calmly asked whether there was any specific evidence that justified escalating what had begun as a routine traffic stop. Daniel answered, only that he believed something about the situation was inconsistent. Marcus nodded politely. "Then I respectfully request that you verify my identity through the appropriate federal or judicial channels before making any further decisions," he said. His voice remained steady, never rising above an ordinary conversation. Daniel dismissed the suggestion with a brief shake of his head. He glanced once more toward the folded robe resting inside the vehicle before saying with unmistakable sarcasm, "A costume does not turn someone into a judge." The words lingered in the evening air. Marcus did not respond with anger. Instead, he simply looked at the officer with quiet disappointment, as though he had heard countless legal arguments collapse under weaker assumptions than this one. A young couple walking along the sidewalk slowed their pace after noticing the exchange. One of them discreetly raised a phone and began recording from a respectful distance, capturing only what could be seen and heard from a public sidewalk. Neither Marcus nor Daniel appeared to notice. Passing vehicles continued moving through the intersection while the flashing emergency lights reflected against nearby storefront windows. The encounter still appeared ordinary to anyone driving past, yet the atmosphere had begun to shift in subtle ways. Daniel contacted dispatch requesting additional assistance and reported that he was dealing with an uncooperative individual claiming to be a federal judge. The dispatcher acknowledged the transmission and began processing the information according to standard procedure. Marcus listened quietly without interruption. He knew that official records often revealed the truth more reliably than emotional debates ever could. Minutes passed as another patrol vehicle arrived. The second officer stepped out, briefly greeted Daniel, and observed the situation without immediately reaching any conclusions. Marcus identified himself once again in the same calm manner, repeating that his credentials could be verified through official government records. Daniel remained unconvinced, interpreting Marcus's composure as further evidence that the story had been carefully rehearsed. He asked Marcus several additional questions, each answered clearly and respectfully. Every response remained consistent. Every statement invited verification rather than argument. Yet certainty had already replaced curiosity. While the conversation continued, the bystanders' recording quietly captured every exchange, preserving not only the words that were spoken, but also the tone in which they were delivered. At the federal courthouse, Marcus's judicial assistant noticed that a scheduled evening conference call had come and gone without him joining. That alone was unusual. Marcus had built a reputation for arriving early, returning calls promptly, and rarely changing his schedule without notice. After attempting to reach his cellular phone several times without success, she contacted another member of his chambers, wondering whether unexpected traffic or a delayed meeting might explain the silence. No one imagined that only a few miles away, an ordinary traffic stop had already begun setting into motion a chain of events that would soon place a local police department, a federal courtroom, and an entire community under the same unforgiving spotlight of objective truth. By the time the second patrol officer arrived, the atmosphere had become noticeably heavier, not because anyone had raised a voice, but because every passing minute increased the distance between assumption and verification. Marcus Bennett remained exactly where he had been instructed to stand, answering every question with the same steady professionalism that had guided him through years on the federal bench. He neither argued nor attempted to leave. Instead, he continued encouraging the officers to verify his identity through official judicial channels, reminding them that government records would answer every question more accurately than speculation ever could. Daniel Brooks, however, had become increasingly committed to the version of events he had already constructed. Admitting uncertainty now would require reconsidering every decision made since activating his emergency lights, and confidence had gradually replaced objectivity. The second officer quietly suggested confirming Marcus's claim through available federal databases or by contacting the appropriate judicial offices. Daniel acknowledged the suggestion, but insisted that the immediate circumstances justified maintaining control of the encounter until he completed his own investigation. Marcus listened carefully before responding with quiet respect. "Officer, I will continue cooperating fully," he said. "I only ask that every action taken today follows the same legal standards that protect every citizen." His words carried no accusation. They sounded more like a reminder than challenge. Nearby, the young couple recording from the public sidewalk continued documenting the interaction without interfering. Their camera captured calm voices, patient responses, and several moments that would later become important when compared against official reports. At the federal courthouse, concern had begun replacing routine. Marcus's judicial assistant informed the clerk of court that repeated telephone calls had gone unanswered. Within minutes, another member of the court administration checked the official calendar, confirming that Marcus had missed 2 scheduled conversations without explanation, something colleagues could not remember happening before. Although no one assumed the worst, they agreed the silence was unusual enough to justify additional inquiries. Back at the roadside, dispatch transmitted a routine response after reviewing available records associated with Marcus's driver's license. The information confirmed that the license was valid, the vehicle registration was current, and no outstanding warrants or public safety alerts existed. Nothing in the response suggested criminal activity. Even so, Daniel remained focused on the robe folded across the back seat and the conclusion he had attached to it. He interpreted the absence of negative information not as reassurance, but merely as incomplete verification. Marcus calmly repeated that his judicial credentials could be confirmed through federal offices before the end of the conversation, if the proper calls were made. Instead of accepting the invitation to verify, Daniel chose to continue questioning him about details that official records could have answered in moments. Every reply Marcus offered remained consistent with the last. His employment history, courthouse location, and daily schedule aligned naturally without hesitation or contradiction. The second officer began observing this consistency with growing curiosity, saying very little while carefully watching both men. Meanwhile, the bystander's recording quietly captured another remark from Daniel about the folded robe, a comment delivered with unmistakable skepticism that would later receive far more public attention than he could possibly imagine. As daylight slowly faded into early evening, more than one camera had already preserved the encounter from different angles. The patrol vehicle body camera continued recording. Nearby traffic cameras overlooked the intersection. Security cameras mounted outside. Neighboring businesses quietly documented the roadside from a distance. None of those devices cared about opinions, appearances, or assumptions. They simply recorded time exactly as it unfolded, frame after frame. Several days later, investigators would gather every one of those recordings into a single, synchronized timeline, and when they finally placed each second beside the official report, the difference between what had happened and what had been believed would become impossible to ignore. The hearing room returned to complete silence as the first recording ended, and the lead investigator activated the synchronized timeline assembled over the previous several days. Every source of digital evidence had been collected independently, preserved according to legal procedure, and matched to a single official clock. Body camera recordings, patrol vehicle cameras, traffic cameras, nearby business security footage, radio dispatch logs, vehicle location data, and computer activity reports now appeared on separate screens arranged side by side. The investigator explained that no witness would be asked to rely on memory until every objective record had been examined. Time itself would become the first witness. Daniel Brooks watched the display with folded arms, still believing the evidence would support the decisions he had made that evening. Across the room, Marcus Bennett remained composed, his attention fixed on the synchronized recordings rather than the people around him. The first timestamp appeared. It showed Daniel beginning to follow Marcus's sedan several blocks before activating his emergency lights. The traffic camera footage confirmed what investigators had already noted during their review. Marcus maintained a steady speed, remained within his lane, used his turn signal appropriately, and obeyed every traffic signal along the route. No recording revealed erratic driving, reckless behavior, or any obvious traffic violation. The timeline advanced second by second. Another screen displayed the computer activity inside Daniel's patrol vehicle. Investigators pointed out the exact moment when he entered Marcus's license plate into the onboard system. The return appeared almost immediately, confirming valid registration and identifying the registered owner without indicating any criminal alert. Seconds later, another log showed that Daniel had continued interacting with the system before every available record had fully loaded. The investigator paused the display and highlighted the timestamps. Less than half a minute separated the first inquiry from Daniel's decision to continue escalating the stop. The synchronized body camera recording resumed. Everyone in the room watched Daniel notice the folded judicial robe resting across the back seat. His attention remained fixed on it far longer than on any official information appearing inside his patrol vehicle. The lead investigator allowed the recording to continue until Daniel made the remark describing the robe as a costume. Nobody in the hearing room reacted outwardly, but several members of the administrative panel quietly made notes. The evidence continued without interruption. Dispatch recordings confirmed that no officer had been instructed to stop Marcus specifically. Earlier that afternoon, a general advisory regarding a different investigation had indeed been broadcast, but the description lacked a matching license plate, driver identification, or any direction authorizing the detention of Marcus's vehicle. Investigators displayed both dispatch records side by side, making the distinction unmistakably clear. The second patrol officer's body camera added another perspective. Unlike Daniel's report, the recording captured Marcus repeatedly encouraging the officers to verify his identity through appropriate judicial channels. Every request remained respectful. Every response invited confirmation instead of confrontation. The investigator zoomed into the transcript generated from the audio, allowing each sentence to appear beside its corresponding video frame. The consistency was impossible to overlook. Daniel slowly shifted in his chair. For the first time since entering the hearing room, the certainty visible on his face began to fade. The evidence was not accusing him with emotion or opinion. It simply measured every decision against recorded reality. The administrative panel requested another replay of the timeline covering the first several minutes of the encounter. Again, the recordings demonstrated that objective verification had always been available before assumptions shaped the direction of the stop. No dramatic revelation was necessary because the quiet precision of authenticated evidence carried more weight than any argument ever could. In that room, every second had become its own witness, and every recorded moment brought the hearing one step closer to a truth that no rewritten report could successfully outrun. The lead investigator allowed the final frame of the synchronized timeline to fade from the screen before turning toward the administrative panel. No one rushed to speak. The evidence had created a silence that carried more weight than any closing argument. Every recording had been examined from beginning to end. Every timestamp had aligned. Every independent source had supported the same sequence of events. What remained was no longer a question of conflicting recollections, but of documented decisions. The chair of the panel thanked the investigative team before inviting Daniel Brooks to respond to the evidence that had just been presented. Daniel slowly stood, glanced toward the display that had moments earlier reflected every critical decision of that evening, and began explaining that he had acted according to his training and personal observations. He stated that he believed the circumstances had justified increased caution and insisted that his intentions had always been to protect public safety. His words were measured, but they lacked the certainty they had carried during his earlier interviews. The panel listened respectfully without interruption. When Daniel finished, one of the senior members quietly opened a copy of his original written report beside the synchronized transcript generated from the body camera recordings. Line after line appeared on the display. The report described uncertainty about Marcus Bennett's identity, while the recordings showed Marcus repeatedly inviting official verification through established judicial channels. The report suggested that Marcus had been reluctant to cooperate, yet every video demonstrated calm compliance and consistent answers. Another panel member displayed the dispatch log, confirming that no specific alert had existed for Marcus or his vehicle. The difference between documented facts and written conclusions became increasingly difficult to explain. Daniel attempted to clarify that he had relied upon his professional judgment under evolving circumstances. The investigator acknowledged that judgment remained an important part of policing, but reminded the panel that professional judgment must always remain open to objective verification. The issue before them was not whether an officer could make a mistake. The issue was whether opportunities to correct that mistake had been available and ignored. The second responding officer was then invited to provide testimony. Speaking calmly, he explained that Marcus had remained respectful throughout the encounter and had consistently requested identity verification through proper channels. He confirmed that Marcus had never attempted to leave, had answered questions directly, and had encouraged the officers to rely upon official records instead of assumptions. His testimony matched both the audio recordings and the synchronized timeline with remarkable consistency. The young couple who had recorded part of the encounter also submitted their video through investigators several days earlier. Although captured from a public sidewalk and only covering a portion of the event, the recording independently preserved Daniel's remark describing the judicial robe as a costume. The investigator explained that the significance of the statement did not rest solely in the words themselves, but in the context surrounding them. The comment had been made before objective verification had been completed, revealing that an assumption had influenced the direction of the encounter long before available evidence had been fully considered. Throughout the hearing, Marcus remained almost entirely silent. He had been offered several opportunities to respond, yet he chose to speak only once. Looking toward the panel rather than toward Daniel, he said, "Every person deserves to be evaluated by verified facts instead of first impressions. That principle protects every citizen equally, including those entrusted with enforcing the law." His words carried neither anger nor triumph. They reflected the same judicial philosophy that had guided his career long before that evening. The administrative panel recessed briefly to review the complete record one final time. As the members quietly left the room, Daniel remained seated, staring at the now dark display where every assumption had been measured against recorded reality. For the first time since the traffic stop began, he appeared to understand that authority could explain a decision, but only evidence could justify it. When the administrative panel returned to the hearing room, every person present rose briefly before taking their seats once again. The atmosphere had changed. Earlier that morning, the room had been filled with uncertainty. Now it carried the unmistakable weight of conclusions supported by verified evidence instead of competing opinions. The chair of the panel opened a folder containing the final findings and spoke with deliberate clarity so there could be no misunderstanding about either the process or the outcome. He explained that the panel had unanimously determined that multiple opportunities had existed to verify Marcus Bennett's identity through official channels before the encounter escalated. Those opportunities had been documented, available, and repeatedly offered by Marcus himself. The synchronized recordings demonstrated that objective verification could have replaced assumption at several different moments during the traffic stop. Because those opportunities had not been reasonably pursued, the panel concluded that professional standards governing investigative judgment, impartial decision-making, and procedural responsibility had not been met. Daniel Brooks listened without interruption. His posture remained straight, but the confidence that had once accompanied every explanation had quietly disappeared. The findings continued. The panel announced that Marcus Bennett had acted respectfully throughout the encounter, had consistently cooperated with lawful requests, and had encouraged verification through established government procedures rather than confrontation. Every independent source reviewed during the investigation supported that conclusion. The chair emphasized that the decision did not elevate Marcus because he served as a federal judge. The same expectation would have applied regardless of occupation. Every citizen deserved to have facts examined before assumptions shaped official action. That principle stood at the center of equal justice under the law. The panel then addressed the department leadership directly, recommending expanded training focused on constitutional protections, objective decision-making, professional communication, and the importance of recognizing confirmation bias during routine encounters. Several command staff members acknowledged the recommendation immediately, recognizing that public confidence depended not upon claiming perfection, but upon demonstrating accountability whenever mistakes occurred. Daniel was informed that disciplinary proceedings would continue according to department policy, and that his police powers would remain suspended pending the completion of those procedures. He accepted the decision quietly, offering no further argument. Across the room, Marcus remained exactly as composed as he had been throughout the hearing. When invited to make a final statement, he stood slowly and looked first toward the members of the panel before briefly meeting Daniel's eyes. Today was never about proving that one profession deserves more respect than another, he said calmly. Police officers and judges both serve the public in different ways. The law depends upon both. But neither uniform nor robe should ever replace the obligation to seek the truth before reaching a conclusion. The strength of our institutions is measured by our willingness to correct ourselves when the facts require it. No one applauded. None was needed. The words settled naturally over the room because they reflected everything the evidence had already shown. As the hearing formally concluded, investigators secured every exhibit for permanent record, while reporters waiting outside received confirmation that the administrative findings had been finalized. News organizations soon reported that the investigation had relied upon synchronized digital evidence from multiple independent sources rather than speculation or public pressure. In the days that followed, training officers throughout the department began reviewing the case as an example of how easily confidence could replace curiosity when assumptions went unchallenged. Marcus returned quietly to the federal courthouse the following Monday, greeting courthouse staff with the same humility that had always defined his career. Nothing about his routine suggested a man seeking recognition. He simply resumed the work of applying the law fairly to every person who entered his courtroom, carrying with him one enduring reminder that justice becomes strongest not when authority speaks the loudest, but when evidence is finally allowed to speak for itself. Several months passed before the story finally settled into history, but its lessons continued moving quietly through courtrooms, police academies, and conversations far beyond the city where everything had begun. The headlines eventually disappeared, replaced by newer events demanding public attention. Yet the official records remained unchanged. They continued telling the same simple story they had told from the beginning. Facts had waited patiently while assumptions raced ahead, and in the end, only the facts remained standing. Federal Judge Marcus Bennett returned to the bench exactly as he had promised himself he would. On his first morning back, he entered his chambers before sunrise, reviewed the day's docket, and unfolded the same black judicial robe that had unexpectedly become part of a national conversation. He paused only for a brief moment before placing it across his shoulders. The robe had never changed. Its purpose had never changed. It represented responsibility rather than status, service rather than privilege, and accountability rather than power. As he entered the courtroom, attorneys, court staff, and members of the public rose in accordance with long-established tradition. Marcus acknowledged them with the same quiet nod he had offered countless times throughout his career. He did not speak about the traffic stop. He did not mention the hearing. Instead, he began the day's proceedings exactly as he always had, reminding everyone present that every decision made inside that courtroom would be guided by evidence, fairness, and equal treatment under the law. Across town, Daniel Brooks faced a very different future. Department disciplinary procedures reached their conclusion after independent review confirmed the administrative findings. His career in law enforcement came to an end, not because one mistake had been impossible to overcome, but because repeated opportunities to correct that mistake had been ignored when objective verification was readily available. The badge he had once worn represented tremendous public trust, and the department concluded that trust required a standard higher than certainty based upon personal assumptions. Daniel accepted the outcome quietly. Friends later recalled that he rarely spoke about the case in public. Those who knew him best believed the experience had forced him to confront difficult questions about judgment, humility, and the responsibility carried by every person entrusted with public authority. Within the police department, the case became part of professional training for newly hired officers and experienced supervisors alike. Instructors emphasized that effective policing depended not only upon confidence and awareness, but also upon the willingness to challenge first impressions before allowing them to shape official action. The synchronized recordings, dispatch records, body camera footage, and independent evidence demonstrated that technology could preserve events with remarkable precision. But they also reminded every officer that character remained the first safeguard against error. Communities throughout the region gradually regained confidence because they witnessed something many people believed was becoming increasingly rare. Institutions had examined themselves honestly, acknowledged documented mistakes, and responded through accountability rather than denial. That response did not erase what had happened, but it demonstrated that justice remained strongest when no individual stood above objective truth. Looking back, many people remember the folded black robe resting quietly across the back seat of an ordinary sedan. Some had once dismissed it as nothing more than clothing. Others eventually recognized it as a symbol of something far more important. Respect does not come from a robe, a badge, or a title. Those are only reminders of responsibilities accepted in service to others. True authority is earned each time a person chooses evidence over assumption, humility over pride, and fairness over prejudice. In the end, the robe was never a costume, and the badge was never a guarantee. The only thing that proved worthy of lasting trust was the quiet courage to let truth speak before judgment ever could.